So this is our capital and history teach-in. They're going to go over the format a little bit for this talk. So I'm going to give some remarks, including an introduction to Platypus, what it is, and where we come from. And those will take about probably 20 to 25 minutes. And then it'll just be an open discussion. I'll probably sit down so I'm not looming over everyone. And we'll just kind of talk about what the remarks were about, and then any questions you have or angles you want to attack the subject. So first, Platypus. The Platypus Affiliated Society was founded in 2006 as an education process focusing on the death of the left. We conduct research, journalism, host panels, and have reading groups around the world investigating the tasks and problems of the old left. The 20s to 30s, new left, 60s to 70s, post-political, 80s to 90s, and now the millennial left, 2000s, and now the Zoomer left as well. We have chapters around the globe and one right here at the University of New Hampshire. If you're interested in joining one of our reading groups or other activities, please speak to either myself or Henry. So, I would like you to view me as a messenger, as in I am bringing important news which is not my own. The news cannot be characterized as wholly good. The message and the messenger are conflicted. The message is both good and bad, as well as bad and good, while the messenger truly wishes he only had good tidings. I wish that I came here to tell you that the present, with its poverty and war, suffering and waste, could be remedied by good intentions, cultivation of virtue, pure communal love, a correct political program, a revitalization of an ancient ritual, or any of the other ideas that are put forth. I cannot tell you this. I can't even tell you that there's hope. However, I can tell you about the memory of hope, which turns out to be quite a bit more than the phrase would imply. First, the bad good news. There is a general sense that something is wrong, a sense that our society is not what it ought to be. The collective institutions of our society disappoint us, whether they be universities, banks, corporations, media outlets, or governments. They profess noble intentions, education, truth, freedom, but in practice deliver an absurd, comical representation of those intentions. We were promised filet mignon and received a bowl of hamburger. Filet mignon are ungenerously salted. Worse, part of us thinks they intended to bring us the hamburger from the start. I would like to propose to you that this sense of wrongness is bound up with society itself, its potential and its inability to fulfill it. So, what exactly is our society? How do we relate to one another? There are many conceptions of society. We can think of ourselves as related by an ethnic tradition, through prayer to a common deity, as citizens of a nation, or simply as humans on the same pale blue dot. This is not what I mean when I say society. Underneath the relationships of kin and country are the incalculable relationships we have to one another through the labor we perform every day. This is society. Let me show you. I didn't bring this pencil all the way here not to use it. So here we have it. To assist us, let's enlist the help of the humble pencil. Through this simple object, we will be able to see partially, but sufficiently, how we relate to one another, the kind of society we live in. To start, we need to travel with the pencil to the forests of the Pacific Northwest and the graphite mines of Sri Lanka. Our guide on this first leg of the journey will be an odd one. I Pencil, an essay from the libertarian intellectual Leonard E. Read. In his essay, Read personifies a pencil who tells us about the great number of people and materials involved in bringing it here. I invite you to really imagine what is being described. It will be important for later in this talk. So, from the perspective of a pencil. Just as you cannot trace your family tree back very far, so it is impossible for me to name and explain all of my antecedents. But I would like to suggest enough of them to impress upon you the richness and complexity of my background. My family tree begins with what is in fact a tree, a cedar of straight grain that grows in Northern California and Oregon. Now contemplate all the saws and trucks and rope and the countless other gear used in harvesting and carting the cedar logs to the railroad siding. Think of all the persons and the numberless skills that went into their fabrication. The mining of ore, the making of steel, and its refinement into saws, axes, motors. The growing of hemp and bringing it through all the stages to heavy and strong rope. The logging camps, with their beds and mess halls. The cookery and the raising of all the foods. Why untold thousands of persons had a hand in every cup of coffee the loggers drink. The logs are shipped to a mill in San Leandro, California. Can you imagine the individuals who make flat cars and rails and railroad engines, and who construct and install the communication systems incidental thereto? These legions are among my antecedents. Consider the millwork in San Leandro. The cedar logs are cut into small pencil-length slats, less than 1/4 of an inch in thickness. These are kiln-dried and then tinted for the same reason women put rouge on their faces. People prefer that I look pretty, not a pallid white. The slats are waxed and kiln-dried again. How many skills went into the making of the tint in the kilns, into supplying the heat, the light and power, the belts, motors, and all the other things a mill requires? Sweepers in the mill among my ancestors? Yes, and included are the men who poured the concrete for the dam of a Pacific Gas and Electric Company hydro plant, which supplies the mill's power. Don't overlook the ancestors present and distant who have a hand in transporting 60 carloads of slats across the nation. Once in a pencil factory, $4 million in machinery and building, all capital accumulated by my thrifty and saving parents, each slat is given 8 grooves by a complex machine, after which another machine lays leads at every other slat, applies glue, and places another slat atop. A lead sandwich, so to speak. 7 brothers and I are mechanically carved from this wooden clinch sandwich. My lead itself, it contains no lead at all, is complex. The graphite is mined in Ceylon, Sri Lanka. Consider these miners and those who make their many tools, and the makers of the paper sacks in which the graphite is shipped, and those who make the string that ties the sacks, and those who put them aboard the ship, and those who make the ships. Even the lighthouse keepers, along the way assisted in my birth, and the harbor pilots. The graphite is mixed with clay from Mississippi, in which ammonium hydroxide is used in the refining process. After passing through numerous machines, the mixture finally appears as endless extrusions, as from a sausage grinder. Cut to size, dried, and baked for several hours, at 1850 degrees Fahrenheit. To increase their strength and smoothness, the leads are then treated with a hot mixture, which includes candelilla wax from Mexico. My cedar receives 6 coats of lacquer. Do you know all the ingredients of lacquer? Who would think that the growers of castor beans and the refiners of castor oil are part of it? They are. Why? Even the processes by which the lacquer is made a beautiful yellow involve the skills of more persons than one could enumerate. Reed is describing to us the relationships of labor that cooperate together to bring this single pencil into my hand. What the pencil says is inarguably true. There are tens of thousands of people that need to work together without knowledge or care of one another to bring this pencil to my hand. The workers of the sawmill and the graphite miners, janitors and managers, truck drivers and secretaries. Now consider that the pencil is not peculiar, but commonplace, that we are surrounded by objects that carry with them this metaphysical window. Every book in my library and every pill in my medicine cabinet can be looked through this way. All of the objects in this classroom, from the chairs to the room itself, can also be seen in this way. They are objects that are purchased in the market, and through purchasing them, we relate to all the people that brought them to us. This answers our original question: what kind of society do we live in? Our society is composed of relationships of labor which are realized in exchange. Now, Reed's pencil is silent on an essential aspect of each laborer: his relationship to the labor itself. What brings John in Oregon to cut down cedar trees? What brings Kashun down the rickety elevators of Sri Lanka to gather shards of graphite? Wages. Each and every person, from the CEO to the sweepers of the factory floor, sells their labor for wages to sustain themselves and their families. They are, almost universally, free to choose whom they sell their labor. There is no law or mandate that forces them to labor for a particular individual or institution. They are all free laborers. This is bourgeois society, our society, the universal exchange of the products of free labor. We now need to complicate this view in 2 ways, first historically, and then with contradiction. Let's consider a loaf of bread from ancient Rome, the same way we looked at the modern pencil. I am bread, lazing about in a basket under a friendly sun. The din of a Roman market is pleasing to me, an auditory prophecy that I will realize my purpose. I hear citizens discuss the new appointment to Pontifex Maximus and the triumph of a decorated Roman general. Apparently, many conquered people will be paraded about. A chattering of sandals clip and clap on the stone road before me. Like the modern pencil, I also have antecedents. My wheat was harvested in the Nile River Valley by the peasants and slaves of Egypt, a client state of the Roman Empire. Strong men of the village would use scythes to reap the stalks of wheat, followed by the hooves of oxen to thresh the stalks. I can still recall the feeling of the wind against my grain as the threshed wheat was tossed into the air, the chaff and straw now wiped from my complexion. The good grain is placed into sacks. Most is kept for local use, but some is set aside for the tax collector. Being an adventurous spirit, I am in the bag for the tax collector, and say goodbye to most of my brothers and sisters who will be milled, mixed, and baked much closer to home. The darkness of the bag lasts months. I am placed and removed from carts and laid in storehouses, passed and stacked on other bags, and wait my turn for the journey across the Mediterranean. One day, a door opens. As if chased by the morning sun, dock workers rush to load me into the ship, which will take me to Rome. They place me in another dark storeroom aboard the ship. I tire of the darkness, but the gentle rock of the ship reminds me that the light is on its way. On my journey over the sea, I can hear the rhythmic grunt of rowers fighting against an unlucky wind, and sailors, or masters as they call themselves, shouting and threatening them to row more vigorously. Poor fellows. I will not bore you with the rest of my journey to the eternal city. Needless to say, I ache from being lifted and tossed so many times. My final destination is the bakery, where I can now be milled into flour and prepared to be mixed with my other compounds, water, yeast, and salt. They also have their journeys. The water from the great aqueducts, the local grapes fermented to make the yeast, and evaporation of the very sea to find the salt. Think of all the people needed to bring those here. We are mixed together into a dough, kneaded, and then baked in a great oven with other loaves. I overheard the bakers complaining about a guild meeting tomorrow. I won't be around long enough for that. After I have won my golden brown crust, I am removed from the oven and placed in a basket, where we first met, if you'll recall, and await the appetite of a hungry Roman. Now, what is the distance between the pencil and the bread? When we see through the pencil, we find the ubiquitous free laborer, more or less well compensated, who is at least nominally free to choose what labor he performs. For the bread, there are various forms of unfree labor. There are the peasants of Egypt, the galley slaves of ancient shipping, the baker who is part of a regulated and hereditary guild, etc. The labor performed in ancient society was organized through the legal and religious mandate of who could do what kind of labor based on their social position, their caste. Did free laborers build the aqueducts or man the salt works? No, of course not. The modern pencil is made from universal free labor. The ancient bread is made by various forms of unfree labor. Yet we can dimly see the bread as a precursor to the pencil. They both share a cosmopolitan quality. Materials travel great distances for a common aim. They both touch the products of civilization, writing, transportation, engineering, and the like. Projecting backwards, we can see the seedlings of our own society in previous societies, but their societies were based on a fundamentally different principle, unfree labor. This historical development from unfree to free labor is the wellspring of the unique potential of our society. Bourgeois society is exponentially more wealthy than its historical predecessors. Free laborers cooperating together in a vast network of exchange generates magnitudes more wealth than societies based on unfree labor. Ancient society can contemplate the stars. Bourgeois society can go to them. Bourgeois society is also the source of our ideals, like freedom and democracy. Free labor undermines the rationality of caste. All are equal to the extent that they can perform labor and exchange their earnings. Pauper, priest, or prince means nothing in the field of exchange. No one asks you when you check out at the grocery store whether you have the right bloodline. And neither do they at a job interview. Bourgeois society, and the values it promotes, wants to wage war against all natural limitations, hunger, ignorance, and slavery. Now, to why bourgeois society cannot fulfill this, the contradiction. One telling aspect of Reed's pencil genealogy is who is exactly doing what to the pencil and its raw materials. Here are some quotes from my pencil, which we have just read, with additional emphasis on my part. Now contemplate all the saws and trucks and rope and the countless other gear used in harvesting and carting the cedar logs to the railroad siding. Another, the cedar logs are cut into small pencil-length slats, less than 1/4 of an inch in thickness. These are kiln-dried. Once in the pencil factory, $4 million in machinery and building, all capital accumulated by thrifty and saving parents of mine. Each slat is given 8 grooves by a complex machine, after which another machine. Curious, what performs most of the work are not humans, but machines. The saws and trucks and ropes, flat cars and rails, and railroad engines. The laborer's work is bound up with his relationship to the machine, one of the, quote, numberless skills that invent, operate, and maintain the machine. Like free labor, this is also a general feature of production. Any episode of How It's Made would demonstrate this to you. Our society is therefore both an association between free laborers and a society of laboring machines. What are the consequences of both of these things being true? How does the advancement in productive machinery affect the free laborer? To develop this point, we need to understand what brings the machine and man into motion. A machine and a man on the side of the road and a machine and a man in the millwork of San Leandro behave very differently. One pair is idle and rusting. The other is possessed with a need to manufacture pencil slats day and night. This poltergeist that causes such a frenzy is labor's dialectical opposite, capital. Capital is the social surplus of free labor. It is the general wealth that comes out of bourgeois society. When workers produce commodities that are purchased in exchange, a profit is made. Through a capitalist, this profit is collected as a body of value to be used for further investment in the production process. Commodities are made, commodities are sold, profit is made, profit is invested in production. Repeat. This cycle, if less undisturbed, has a natural tendency to increase capital. Before the Industrial Revolution, an investment in future production was primarily the purchase of living labor. Capital would seek out workers and offer them wages to produce the goods that society desired in the market. But capital, like labor, wants to increase itself. It wants to buy cheap and sell dear. To increase itself, capital has two paths. It can either sell its commodities for a greater price or reduce the costs associated with the production of that commodity. Let's focus on cost reduction. To reduce the cost of production is primarily a question of increasing productive efficiency. The same amount of capital that can produce 10 pencils in an hour is superior to that which can produce 2 pencils in an hour. Each pencil represents a smaller proportional investment, a greater possibility of profit, and therefore a greater possibility of capital increasing itself for the next production cycle. In the earlier period of bourgeois society, this tendency of capital manifested in better coordination and cooperation of workers, also known as the division of labor. But with the introduction of industrial machinery, what made production more productive also made living labor less necessary. What took 100 workers before the machine takes 10 workers now. When this capital has produced its pencils, comes to market, it now finds that those pencils cannot be purchased, as other capitals have done the same as it, and society is too impoverished to take part in the exchange, which foils its only other way of increasing itself with an increase in price. This is capital's diabolic paradox. In production, it seeks to diminish the value of labor to its absolute minimum. In exchange, it seeks to realize labor's value at its maximum. Labor has no value, labor has all value. Contradiction. You may object to what I have just described, as in, it's not the world you see. Unemployment is low enough. Sure, there is poverty, but it has other causes. Society is quite wealthy, and most people can afford a pencil. True enough. What I have illustrated for you is a great social dynamic, one that is in motion through the rhythmic activity of all society's members. Those institutions I mentioned at the beginning, the universities, governments, corporations, banks, etc., do not sit on their hands. They take action against the effects of this contradiction. But they serve two masters. As institutions of bourgeois society, they proclaim its values: knowledge, truth, freedom, equality. but as institutions of the contradiction of capitalism, they are forced to respond to the results of that contradiction, which is primarily a question of maintaining employment and mitigating unemployment. Seen this way, schools serve as daycares for working parents and training facilities for students to outpace technological development. Prisons and police manage an ever-growing class of people that are tossed out of society as the chronically unemployed. Retirement is a scheme to wrangle just enough surplus to provide for the elderly after their working years so they don't starve to death. And governments create policy on immigration to manage the labor market. So, we live in a society of self-contradictory labor, a society of capital. This is the source and sense of wrongness bourgeois society has and continues to promise so much. The contradiction it finds itself in renders it unable to fulfill that promise. The institutions of our society distort themselves reacting to the effects of this contradiction. Our society of capital has unleashed greater productive forces than any pre-modern civilization could imagine, and yet it also appears as a management of misery or disappointment. This is a unique problem that humanity has confronted itself with. What would it look like to solve it? So, on to the good, bad news. Let's say I've convinced you of the plausibility of this conception of society, a society that is constituted by the contradiction of labor. Then let's say you want to do something about it. Where would you start? First, we need to draw out some basic consequences of this view of society. Society is international in character. As I hope I've made obvious, labor relations do not respect borders even if nation-states take responsibility for managing them. Also, this contradiction has persisted for over 200 years, since at least the first Industrial Revolution. This means that the contradiction itself is likely durable, it will not be resolved by its own inner dynamic, and that every attempt to overcome it has been a failure. But there have been attempts, and we would be wise to look back to see what lessons can be learned. But we need to look for two traits to orient us to this investigation in the past. First, we need to find a movement that was conscious of the contradiction in its breadth and depth, aware of its international character and the profound way it conditions society. Put negatively, no movement has accidentally overcome the contradiction of capitalism as part of its cultural or political activity. Second, we would need to find a movement that has within itself the objective possibility of overcoming that contradiction. Put negatively again, a sophisticated description of the trajectory of an asteroid hurtling towards Earth is of no use if there's nothing that can affect its path. We would need to find where consciousness met capacity in the highest degree. This line of reasoning culls a significant number of movements from consideration. To my mind, all except one. The workers' movement for socialism, which reached its zenith in this revolutionary period following the First World War. The period from 1917 to 1923 is quite literally bursting with possibility. There is a real sense from its participants that a new world is coming into being from both those that desire it and those that fear it. There was a consciousness of the contradiction of society in the revolutionary Marxist intellectuals, most notably Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, but also others like Kautsky, and an enormous workers' movement to carry forward that consciousness. I have done my best in my remarks to demonstrate to you what I am asserting. But in this instance, you're just going to have to take my word for it. In the meantime, now I've identified a movement that could overcome capitalism and knew that it was trying to do this. Where did it come from, and what did they think? Because God loves to play hard but not impossible games, capitalism provided a curious pair, a class of people, the proletarianized working class, that had an objective interest in a new society through its misery in this one, and a dream, socialism, which recognized the potentials in capitalism for change. It was this combination that would fuse into the single greatest attempt for universal human emancipation. At the beginning of the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution advanced and the machine wreaked its havoc on the working class did not sit idly by. They combined themselves together both economically in workers' associations and politically in parties. The workers' experience of society as wretched and disposable contradicted with society's value of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The workers spontaneously struggled for a society that would be true to its own ideals, that a society based on free labor should also dignify free labor. Their demands, like the limitation on the working day and universal suffrage, reflected the same. While the working class organized itself, the idea of socialism developed in the minds of the well-to-do. They recognized from a distance what the workers experienced immediately, that the abundance created by industry did not produce the expected abundance of society, but instead deepened its immiseration. Industrialists like Robert Owen and philosophers like Charles Fourier planned and executed utopian societies to serve as examples to be emulated for their moral and rational superiority. These attempts foundered against the nascent class interests of the capitalists, who were more interested in protecting their private property, even as it undermined the rationality of society itself. Socialism would have to get political. And it did. Over the course of the 1800s, socialism and the workers' movement became more deeply intertwined. Socialist politicians like Louis Blanc in France and Ferdinand Lassalle in Germany took up leadership roles in working-class parties, and socialist intellectuals like Proudhon found eager ears amongst the working masses. Both sides benefited. The intellectuals found a subject to advance their ideas in the world, and the working masses were given theory to understand their practice. Thus, the workers' movement and socialism became the workers' movement for socialism. It was this historical product, that the workers' movement for socialism, that Marx confronted and criticized. Marx sought to clarify to this movement its role in history. What did their practice signify? Not a reconstitution of this society, as the reformists advocated, or a sweeping away of this society, as the sectarians argued, but the qualitative transformation to a new society based on the productive developments of capitalism. The great expansion of productive capacities will continue. The contradiction between the demands of labor and the demands of capital will deepen. No state decree, no expansion of suffrage, no successful strike will reign in history. But history can be tamed, so says Marxism, if only the workers become conscious of their historic task, to complete the abolition of labor that capitalism began. The proletarianized working class are the negative image of socialism, a permanent reminder of how little necessary labor there is. To accomplish this, the workers would have to take political power as agents of this historical transformation. They would need to establish what is known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Then, the contradiction of labor could be worked through by developing new social relations beyond free labor. After decades of diligent struggle, an international body emerged, the Second International, which was composed of working-class parties led by revolutionary socialists all over Europe, as well as America. Utopia was no longer the plaything of imaginative intellectuals. It had nestled up to the beating hearts of millions of workers in the center of the capitalist world. These were not only political parties, but entire worlds of cooperatives and gymnasiums, banks, trade unions, bars and festivals, day laborers, Christians and Brits, seamstresses, atheists and Germans, people from every profession, religion, and nationality of Europe carried the flag of social democracy. Highly organized and poised to take power, the leadership of the Second International prepared for the next inevitable crisis of capitalism to manifest, and seized this crisis as an opportunity for revolution. Then the crisis came, in the form of the First World War. The flagship party of the Second International, the German SPD, voted for war credits for the German government on August 4, 1914. The socialist parties of other countries followed their lead. This caused the first great schism of Marxism between those that supported the war and those that opposed it. Broadly speaking, Social Democrats supported the war, and what would become the Communists opposed it. The Social Democrats thought by aligning themselves with their nation, they will be able to preserve the party to advance progressive reforms in the future. The Communists held on to the previous position of the Second International, so the previous Social Democrat position, best exemplified by the Basel Manifesto of 1912, which was a manifesto adopted by the Second International. In case war should break out, it is their duty to intervene in favor of the speedy termination and with all their power to utilize the economic and political crisis created by the war to arouse the people and thereby hasten the downfall of capitalist class rule. The activity of the Communists from 1914 to 1923 could be characterized as a rushed attempt to recover the possibility of the Second International, now a, quote, stinking corpse, as Rosa Luxemburg put it. In the Great Revolutionary Tumult, only one party made any lasting headway: the Bolsheviks, led by a man named Vladimir Lenin in October 1917. All other revolutionary moments in Italy, Hungary, and most importantly in Germany were not able to consolidate themselves. After this, the narrative becomes a bit more fractured. There's Stalinism and Maoism, Trotskyism and all its variations, heterodox communist movements like Council Communism, post-war social democracy, the New Left, and many, many more. To tell you about it would be a bit like describing each shard of a shattered light bulb, a gargantuan task which I am not prepared to do. The point is that there was once a whole, and now there are only ever disintegrating parts. And for all their differences, none have been able to recover the consciousness and capacity represented by the Second International, the two prerequisites to addressing the bad good news. Now, losing battles is part of war, and we shouldn't fault the socialists of the past for being defeated in the field. Politics is a difficult business, after all. However, what is unpardonable and unforgivable is that the left has obscured its own history through the abandonment of its own historical consciousness, either in celebrating the accomplished fact, Stalinism's socialism in one country, and post-war social democracy's veneration of the welfare state, or the sectarian practice of encasing themselves in Leninist amber as if the 20th century never happened. The left has objectively regressed. Its ability to act in the world is much more limited than it was 100 years ago. That is something many will agree to. But it has also subjectively regressed. It dreams of new deals and proud post-colonial military states, not of a free humanity. Yesterday's defeats became today's horizons. The bad goodness of capitalism is that it is a contradictory society, a society of poverty and plenty, a society of disappointment and promise, a sick society that furnishes the compounds for its own cure. The good badness of the struggle for socialism is that it happened, that it failed, and that it never recovered from its failure. That is our present, and any attempt to alter the present must take into account those two realities. Marxism was historically effective precisely because of its consciousness of history. It attempted to grasp society's historical development and its possibilities for change. Everything else, the moral courage of its adherents, the sting of its propaganda, the illumination of its descriptive analysis, is subordinate to this historical consciousness, which is why Platypus exists, to recover and preserve historical consciousness in the present for use in the future, a historical consciousness that the left has abandoned for over a century. And why do we preserve this historical consciousness? To carry on the hope that consciousness can once again find capacity. A subject in the present that will rise to the challenge of overcoming society's contradiction. We have it in our power to begin the world over again, said the great American revolutionary Thomas Paine. Let's struggle to reclaim that power once again. Thank you. All right, so now it's just kind of an open discussion. So if anybody had any questions about what was said, or maybe about Platypus in general.
I have a question.
Henry.
In what way, in terms of like a Marxist consciousness, I think it's easy to see how, that doesn't exist today. Just, even from a pure numbers game, the number of Marxists in the world
refer to themselves as Marxists?
Yeah, like even, what Platypus would consider vulgarization of Marxists, it's a pretty small group. But I mean, I think there's parts of the left that would still argue that they have this, unity of capacity and consciousness, as you put it. Even, I don't know, like Democratic Party, the Republican Party might argue that this exists, that they learn from their history, this sort of thing, right? So in what way, I guess, does, would a reconstitution of a Marxist left distinguish itself, in your view, in this way? From an existing left, at least.
I think that would be a very difficult thing to recognize. It's kind of like you know it if you see it. I suppose if you're, I guess sensitive to that, that history. But, I think that it's really that, when we think of conscious capacity for what, right? there's a sense in which that the left has historically regressed itself over the last 100 years, but it moves the goalpost backwards, right? And then talks about the glory days of FDR, even though socialists were critical of the New Deal, right, and saw it as part of capitalist politics, right? And so, in terms of recognizing what a Marxist consciousness would look like, I think right now, I think it would be in very vague terms, right? It would be having the widest sense of possibility open to your activity, which is something that the left also sort of precludes. Is like, when you're in this kind of extremely limited position to act in the world, the last thing you'd want to do is take options off the table. And the left is very not almost pathological about the way in which it sees its practice needed to act out in the world, which is one of the tasks of Platypus, is to remove these kinds of thought taboos and bad practices, because we need to have sort of a free and flexible thought in order to move forward. Noah.
So, great talk. I really liked it. I wanted to say, you mentioned Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky. And I wanted to hear a bit more about Trotsky, although mainly for the reason, right, that it does get into that territory that you didn't want to touch on so much because it's just so much to touch on, namely the 20th century after the First World War. Lenin and Luxemburg both die, shortly after the First World War. But Trotsky kind of gets to live on and see what communism as an institution has become, right? And has to orient himself towards that. And, I think Trotsky kind of is an interesting case study in this issue of, as you put it, capacity versus consciousness, or hopefully the two can come together. Because it seems today like all you can have is either this sort of what people might slander as a Trotskyist attempt at holding on to that critical consciousness that was Marxism. And then people are like, oh, that's unrealistic, right? That's ultra left, that's utopian, that's armchair daydreaming, and you're not going to get a revolution that way. It seems like either that's your choice or the other choice is what you might paint with a broad brush as the Stalinism, right? Where you have to justify a totally indefensible, horrific reality on the grounds that, we don't want to support this horrible regime that, violates the civil rights of their citizens and blah, blah, blah. But don't you know that they're offering resistance against capitalism? So therefore you have to, right? And the way that Trotsky attempted, right, to, did Trotsky see this problem? Was this it wouldn't have made sense to him to think of the theory and practice as split in this way? I mean, what do we think of Trotsky? I guess it's a question for Sam or anyone who wants to take it up.
I mean, I'll take a stab at it. I think that, I think Trotsky, maybe he had a doubt in his head that the workers' movement, I think Chris Catron put it in Trotsky's later writings, it's very clear that he's humanity's kind of backed up against a wall, right? That there's a sense in which, Trotsky, I think, dies in the 30s. So he's seeing fascism come to a head. The point of him holding on to the historical insights and positions that he had, learned throughout his experience as revolutionary was to hold on to them so they would have political efficacy later, right? But that clearly didn't pan out, and I think that that's what I was saying about the Leninist amber of the sectarians, is that there's a sense in which that these positions are also historically contingent, right? And we do clearly exist in a different historical situation. So it's about being not just having a Marxist consciousness of history, right? It's not about reconstituting what the outcomes of Marxist thought circa 1900, right? It's about like using those same historical sensibilities to orient ourselves in the present, right? Which also has to take into account the fact that the the workers' movement for socialism is dead. It's like it's not here, and that was something that Marx took for granted, all socialists took for granted, and we could even say to their detriment, to the extent that they thought it was just going to continuously advance.
I vaguely recall Hitchens saying that the lack of such a movement felt like a phantom limb to him after the fall of the Soviet Union, and kind of fight flowed from him. And that's about it. I got it.
It's interesting.
That is interesting. So did it make sense the way I was using this pencil? Like I'm curious what people's feeling about this conception of society, because when I first joined Platypus, the concept of like labor relations being like how I relate to the world was a new idea to me. But this idea of like we have we are a society of labor, and that also the manner in which our production is done has this not it's not like monocausal, right? Like it's not like nothing exists outside of this dynamic, but it has an overdetermination to all of the different aspects of our society. I mean, what did people make of that? Is that something that made sense in the talk?
Yeah. I've never heard the entirety of iPencil, even though I knew the concept of it. So it was interesting to actually hear sort of the details of iPencil, and also the feudalist variation was very interesting, because that gets across very well that this isn't necessarily unique to capitalism, that society is very deeply interdependent.
Right, but it is bourgeois society is unique to the extent that it becomes, like people will, I don't know, I remember watching like a documentary about like, it was like one of those like feminist British documentaries about like, let's look at all of the women business owners of the Middle Ages, and so we're almost like, like our compulsion, right, is to like look back into the past and find like the most incidental version of ourselves there. And even in their cases, right, like often, a medieval baker lady would be, she would inherit the ability to be a baker from her father, right? And that's seen as like not important. The important part is that they're exchanging coins or something like that. And I think it misses the mark on what is like, the critical element of our society. And then another point is one of the elder statesmen of Platypus, this guy James Fawn, who's like an American, he is an American historian, pointed out that in northwestern Europe, Britain and northern France, feudalism by the 1500s is pretty much dead. There was a aristocracy. You could find kings and princes and all of the titles there too, but there was no relationship of serfdom, and there was this tremendous amount of movement of labor that was eventually exported to America, and the all of the contemporaries of the time acknowledged that this was like there was this tremendous increase in well-being, in the items people had access to the life expectancy, to the number of children they had. Adam Smith probably writes it at it most directly. But for Platypus, we emphasize the point of bourgeois society, because if you don't, then it immediately turns into a question of oppression, right? We start reverting to this concept of not about overcoming society, right, but towards thinking about things in terms of somebody who has some power and somebody who doesn't, and that conflict in between, which is not, it does happen in capitalism, but it's not unique to it at all. What's unique about capitalism is the free labor and its contradiction.
I also noticed, similar on the same theme, your talk differs from a lot of the modern left in that it didn't mention exploitation even once. At no point were you like you know what the problem with capitalism is? It's workers' exploitation, and that it didn't even come up. It was the I guess maybe the production of unemployment or the completion of that goal, like you said, of capital expanding itself and that needing labor was the central crisis surrounding that exploitation. Do you feel that that is like the central problem rather than exploitation? Are they intertwined?
I mean, they are intertwined. I think that that's undeniable in the sense that, I mean, to write this talk, I was, watching news documentaries about Sri Lankan graphite miners, right? And their lives are pretty terrible. And that's why I use the word nominally free laborers, right? In the sense that they aren't actually by law forced to work for this company, but circumstances are thus that they pretty much have to. And there's an unfreedom, a coercion about the way in which they have to operate, but that comes from this contradiction. It doesn't come from how mean or nice the boss is of the graphite mine, right? Or whether it's owned by the state of Sri Lanka, which it is, or by a private person. And so, in some ways, like the fact that there are people who are oppressed in capitalism is like I don't know what to say. Like, it's not something that is, I think, the central purpose. And this can also be difficult when you read the Marxists because they're writing in a propagandic fashion, and it can be very easy to read them as if that is the point, right? Because they have this like great, moral indignation about the world. But a lot of people are really upset that people suffer, right? And that's not what made these individuals historically significant.
I have a question about, so I was late. Yeah, so I missed possibly your introduction where you talk about the further back stages of human development. And I walked in when you were already talking about social relations based on labor versus maybe feudal era and slave type social relations. Did you say anything about like the earlier kind of crises of humanity? And if not, because you do mention like Fourier, in the ways that humanity could kind of orient towards nature a little bit more, because Fourier famously has this idea that, society could turn the oceans into lemonade or something like this, right? Where there's like transforming the physical world in some way that's unimaginable to the average person at his time and our time. So I'm kind of wondering about why you focused on the social relations of labor as kind of like, the focal point, the majority of your talk. And since that focus begs the question of like, well, what are potentially new social relations? I also want to know, well, how about the other types of relations that are bound up with a new social relation? For example, what about man's potential new relationship to nature? What about man's potential new relationship to himself? Are these things that you or Marxism has an answer to? Should we ask these questions or no?
It's interesting you bring up the Fourier quote because I was kind of thinking about like the way in which the left no longer dreams of seas of lemonade, right? Like there is kind of a Fourier has this kind of eccentric, playful quality. But to answer your question directly, I think that in terms of the crises of the various like stages of crises. But can you expand on that a little bit?
Like in the Paleolithic era, there could have been like a crisis of man's like kind of direct relationship to nature, where it's kind of if there's a hunter-gatherer society, what we'd now call hunter-gatherer society, there hasn't yet been the development of like agriculture of the Neolithic era. And so it's more of a direct crisis of, well, like the utilitarians would talk about man's like proliferation being limited by like his concentration on land, like the amount of people on a density or whatever, and resource scarcity, like being the direct limitations of humanity at that time. And so therefore you could have like the crisis of humanity at that time being one of like nature or, you know what I mean? And then
like overcoming these crises, like that's, and the other thing I was trying to highlight in this talk was that the possibilities of capitalism are, just magnitudes greater, right? That the possibilities of, the crises that the various other crises of like, settled agricultural society, or, the different, I don't know, religious or ethnic divisions that come up over history were never going to be resolved or could not be resolved in the same way that capitalism could. And that, I think, answers their second question, which is like, why focus on the relations of labor? Because of its potential. As far as like what the future looks like, I mean, Marxism and Marxists are generally pretty hesitant to talk about the future, right? You'll get some like whispers of it with Lenin talking about the decaying of the state, right? And maybe the new social mores of how people will operate. But, I think, and this kind of goes to what you were talking about before, Dominic, about these like prescriptive ways of thinking about socialism, which I don't think are necessarily like, they might not be harmful, but that's not our problem. Our problem is to put people in a position where they could actually think about what that would mean, right, for them. And we might be able to use something like a vague prescriptive analysis as like a way of advocating, saying that your life is like this, it could be like that, right, in a tactical sense. But the way it actually would play out would have to be a technical question of people who actually are in a position to do so. And so it's not, I think it's one of those, like, we have, our plates full enough with like the kinds of problems that we have to work through. And I don't think imagining what socialism would be like is, I think it's actually very much like utopia being the imaginative plaything of intellectuals at this point.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Sure. So I recently attended a debate between the Platypus Affiliate Society at Boston College and their libertarian student group. And the libertarian student group started out by saying that they have a conception of kind of, if you will, man's relationship to everything based on scarcity, which kind of applies from prehistory until the present. And so how would that be overcome, or why is that not the primary problem? Like, does that problem of scarcity and how to like allocate resources, is that the problem? Isn't that the problem that we are facing today?
It's funny,
Will it always be?
because it's funny you say that, because like that, I mean, that was basically the argument of like Malthus, right, of saying that, Britain can't support this amount of people because we're going to run out of trees or something, right, for firewood. And, I mean, bourgeois society capitalism has proven that, like, what was once scarce energy can become abundant, right? We might solve fusion shortly. And I don't even think we need socialism to like be like, yeah, scarcity isn't really the thing at issue. Maybe scarcity of some things, but then, scarcity drives people to want to overcome it. And in many instances we have, and in a lot of instances we have a false scarcity, right?
Is it created by capital, the false scarcity?
I mean, it's created by the management of it, right? I think, you could probably find examples of people creating false scarcity. I think I don't know why Skrelly is coming to mind. If he was trying to hold back diabetes medication. Yeah. And so you can find instances of that, but like, in order for something to, in those instances is a really good example of something that's trying to push the value down to zero, right? But needs to realize itself in exchange. So then you have things like, the corn lobby in America, right? Where if corn was actually was functioned like a market, the farmers would just immediately go out of business. So they need to have those purchases. But yeah, to your question about the scarcity, scarcity principle is that, the question to me is like, why, what is the social blocker for something becoming not scarce, right? For something being so abundant that we wouldn't even have to think about, its value. That would be an absurd question. Cool. So any concluding thoughts? I don't want to sit here in silence for too long.
I have one follow-up question, loose
Yeah, go
ghost
ahead.
question maybe to think of. You like kind of raised how it seems like, the seeds of bourgeois society kind of existed in some form or fashion, like long before, the 18th century, in Roman society, we can kind of see something that appears like it. Maybe it appears falsely that way. But nevertheless, the point stands. It seems like the kind of, germ of it existed long ago. And, the Marxists preach this idea that it's the socialization of labor that you kind of described through the I-pencil is kind of this germ of socialism within capitalism, right? This is the basis, what we organize on. This kind of socialization appears very differently to us today. There aren't men in factories or whatever, like there were in the 19th century. And again, I don't want to put you in a position to speculate, if we were to build the new socialist movement today, what exactly would that look like? But I do want to raise the question, kind of what the potential basis, we look back at the socialist movement of the past, this idea of linking theory and practice, but does the kind of same objective basis exist within society's day to rebuild socialist movement in your minds? How it might have been done in the 19th century during the process of the first and second industrial revolutions, or is society, advanced, or however you want to put it, to such a point that, the kind of socialist organization of the past doesn't really tell us much about, the socialist organization of the future.
I think that's largely correct, right? That's why I left at the end about, keeping capacity sort of nondescript, in the sense of that it's to find a subject, right? And that, everything is on the table. I would say that it's that sense of wrongness, right? It's that sense that we live in this world and it's not the way it should be. That is the thing that is, that will generate the discontents, that are the things that need to be politically captured, digested and advanced. And I think the labor question is unavoidable, but, the imagination that we need to, I think some socialists are like, yeah, we need to get the jobs back to America so we can have the factory workers again. So then we can have the revolution, right? We need to, I just completely open our minds to a wide array of strategies and tactics. But that won't be done through, it's not going to be solved via Platypus, right? Platypus, like I said, is more about the historical consciousness, the theory part of the theory praxis split. But I remember talking at the Platypus convention, Ed, who is part of the Campaign for a Socialist Party, and really she's trying to dig into, does society still want freedom, right? Are there individuals in society who are, can be motivated by freedom, which is the watchword of bourgeois society.
What's freedom?
So in Platypus terminology, it's freedom of society, right? So it's the freedom of society to transform itself, which is the collective relations, right? So it's not about like, I mean, individual freedom obviously is a component of that. But the, you know, like all those labor relations I'm talking about, right? Like it's the individuals who are connected within that to then be able to, as a group, manifest new ways of being, right? New means of becoming, to use the Rousseauian language. So it's not about freedom from, freedom to, but freedom for society.
What was her answer? The woman who was willing to delve into this. Do people still want freedom?
I mean, you know, she's not doing it because she doesn't believe that it's, you know, possible. I think that the difficulty seems to be that there's, you know, a tremendous amount of subjective segregation that goes along in society right now, like aesthetic taste communities is the way it's been put before, and people have difficulty, you know, communicating with one another and you know, building, you know, shared bonds over, you know, the various ways in which we've decided to kind of construct ourselves. But you know, this is a long process, right? And it requires a lot of patience, and there's, you know, and there's no way around it, right? If there was a way around it, you know, the left would have done it already, I think.
Yeah, I'm a little curious about this too. So, if you said freedom is the watchword of the bourgeois revolutions or bourgeois society, but people generally think in terms of, or another, when you're talking about the social relations of bourgeois society, it seems to be that people want to realize the value of their labor. They want to realize, have some like connection between their labor and this concept of society, which their labor allegedly supports and is fundamental to. So it seems like, on the one hand, bourgeois society's main word, is it sufficient for it just to be about work? Like, you know, I as a worker, even if I don't care about freedom, is it enough that I, you know, want my job to, you know, be recognized or give me value, or, you know, be connected to society in some way, even if I don't think in terms of like the ability of society to change itself?
I mean, I think that the actual practical manifestation of it is going to have a lot of, you know, many people who probably think in those terms, right? And that, I mean, this was one of the tensions of the old socialist movement, was that the practical activity was functionally trying to reconstitute bourgeois society on different levels, right? It was about unionizing, right? So workers would get better wages. That's a way of that labor realizing its value. But then the overall goal was to overcome these, right? So I think it'll be unavoidable in the sense that, you know, bourgeois subjects are going to, you know, as laborers, right? We all work. We want to get the most value out of our labor, and when that's denied to us, we feel cheated in some way, right? But I think, especially in this nascent form, like those kinds of, I don't think that somebody who is, you know, their singular motive, right, is that will be able to be part of the germs of a new socialist movement of some kind. Certainly not in, like, you know, a monomaniacal way.